The central banks, the robbers, have enriched themselves and their beneficiaries, the major stockholders and investors, by stealing from the following victims: everyone who holds currency in their bank account, wallet, pocket or purse or pension, everyone who pays federal taxes, and everyone who makes payments on a mortgage, auto loan, or any other kind of loan. Are you on the list above? Are you on it more than once? This entire chapter leads to a very big quandary. Central bankers are supposed to be some really smart people. They're a bunch of PhD economists. If they don't understand the wealth transfer that they are causing, then they are incompetent and do not belong in their jobs. But if they do understand the wealth transfer and this theft that they are creating, then they are immoral and they belong in jail. Which do you think?
In my last video, I said that the evidence was overwhelming, that the jury has returned, and that the verdict is in. Freedom creates prosperity. Well, I want to present that evidence today, but first, I'd like to thank everybody that made comments on my last video. Even though it didn't get a lot of views, I know that it was one of my better videos because of all of your comments. I thank you very much. Now, the evidence that I'm going to present here that I was talking about is in a video that I made more than a year ago. I made it just before the release of my book. I did chapter 4 online on ggsr21.com, and then I made 8 videos to go with the different sections of my book. And in part 7 of chapter 4, all of the evidence gets presented. A lot of the data comes from the Economic Freedom of the World report, and it is absolutely overwhelming. Freedom, along with strong property rights and the rule of law, does create prosperity. So, this video was posted more than a year ago, and it only got about 1,000 views. So here it is for you now. There are other videos to come, but this is the section that contains all of the evidence. The following presentation is based on content from my new book, The Great Gold and Silver Rush of the 21st Century. To read the free online chapters or order the book, please go to ggsr21.com. Thanks. Welcome to The Great Gold and Silver Rush of the 21st Century, Chapter 4, Part 7, Reverse Robin Hoods. The world's central banks are the biggest buyers of assets on the planet, and they do it by counterfeiting. They just type brand new currency into existence, and they buy something with it. When they do that, though, they increase the currency supply, and the purchasing power that they're using to buy these assets comes by stealing it from the poor and middle class, anybody holding currency. It's sort of like a bunch of reverse Robin Hoods with the fraudulent reserve leading the charge. I was going to call them the fraudulent reverse because they are reverse Robin Hoods. They steal from the poor and middle class and give it to the richest people on the planet every second of every day. Now, I remember when a billionaire was a wealth beyond imagining. Even when I was a kid, a millionaire was just somebody with astronomical wealth. 2018 saw the emergence of the first centibillionaire, someone whose wealth exceeds $100 billion. But just 4 years later, there were 10 centibillionaires and 2 duo-centibillionaires, somebody with assets that exceeds $200 billion. So from the time quantitative easing started, these companies, their stock prices rose. Netflix by a factor of 238 times, Amazon 95 times, Apple 67 times, Microsoft 23 times, and Alphabet, which is Google, 22 times. Tesla was not yet publicly traded when QE started or through much of QE, so it is not on this list. When it comes to the richest people on Earth, I'm sure that if quantitative easing and interest on excess reserves had never happened, that both the rise in their stocks and thus their wealth would have been far, far less than half of what it ended up to be. Jeff Bezos and the rest of them don't know it. But anyone whose net worth is tied to the value of their stock portfolios is in possession of stolen property. Purchasing power stolen
from the poor and the middle class. But to spare you any suspense, it's the Federal Reserve and the world's other major central banks that are once again the villains here. Are you fed up yet? This next series of charts, what I've done here is I've broken the population into wealth percentiles. There's the bottom 50%, there's the top 10%, the top 1%, the bottom 90%. So I talk about that. And this first chart is a picture of the amount of dollars that the bottom 50% is holding, the IOU dollars, in their checking accounts and cash on hand. The Federal Reserve supplies this data. And what you see is that the bottom 50%, they're in their checking accounts and the cash on hand. It was about $10.5 billion in 2007. And as of this writing, which was a few months ago, it was $276 billion, an increase of 26 times from the low in 2007. But this picture of currency in demand deposits, checkable deposits, which is checking accounts, is basically a picture of what is now driving inflation. These are the people that use this currency to buy groceries and gasoline. So they're feeling a little bit more secure because of all the stimulus checks that happened during the pandemic and the fact that they didn't have any place to spend their currency during lockdowns. So if they still had a job, the currency accumulated in their checking accounts. After the pandemic ended, we saw inflation rage. This is where it came from. And, inflation, it'll because of changes in velocity, it will bounce up and it will bounce down, but it ultimately has to strike an equilibrium with the amount of currency that was created and prices of goods and services that we use that currency for, because that's all currency is: a medium of exchange, a temporary storage device for that value, and a measurement tool. You can give things a price. So the next chart is, believe it or not, exactly the same chart, but I've had to compress it way, way down. So the bottom 50% is this blue line on the bottom here, and I've put on top of it the richest 1%. So the bottom 50% against the top 1%. And what you see here is that in 2007, the bottom 50%, their wealth in checking accounts was $10.5 billion, and the top 1% only had $12 billion. This is all according to the Federal Reserve. But the bottom 50% went from $10.5 billion, it went up 26 times. The top 1%, their wealth in checking accounts, went from $12 billion up 111 times to $1.33 trillion. Now, these are not the people that are, even though their wealth went up 111 times, they can't buy 111 times more groceries and gasoline. So where is this wealth going to go? With other assets crashing as the everything bubble pops, stocks, bonds, real estate being risky investments where they can possibly lose this, I do believe that this is going to seek safe haven alternative assets. And so a whole lot of this currency is going to come seeking gold and silver in the next crisis. And this is enormous. So moving on to the next chart, I want to show you some of the wealth disparity and income inequality and why and whose fault is it anyway. This first chart shows the richest 1% and the poorest 50%. So from 51 to 99, they're missing. They're not on this chart. The richest 1% went from 7.6% of checkable deposits to 31. So almost a third of the checkable deposits out there are owned by the richest 1%, while the bottom 50% went from 14% down to 6.4% during that same time period. The next chart is the richest 1% and the poorest 99%. So this chart includes everybody, the entire population. But you can see that I've rounded it here to 8% instead of 7.6. But the richest 1% goes from 8% to 31%, while the poorest 99%, the bottom 99%, because there's a lot of pretty wealthy people there in that top 10%, went from 92% of the deposits down to 69% of the deposits, less than 70%. From 92 down to 69. This is huge. This next chart is the one that is really important here. Here is the top 10% compared to the bottom 90%. They're both on this chart, so it gives you this mirror image of each other. But what's interesting, if you average this, you can see that the red line, up until the crisis of 2008, was usually on the bottom, and the blue line was usually on the top. So the bottom 90% held about 52% of the checking deposits in the United States, and the top 10% held about 48%. But then with the crisis of 2008, Ben Bernanke, and the responsibility of this lays solely on his shoulders. Ben Bernanke and his policies caused this enormous wealth transfer that we've tracked throughout this book and throughout this chapter that you're getting to read and watch for free online. I want you, please, send this to everybody you can, because everybody needs to know about this wealth transfer. And in this chapter, I've shown you how it happens, the mechanics of it, what caused it, and here is the proof that it actually happened. So the top 10% went from about 48% of the deposits up to about 66%, so about 2/3 of all of the checkable deposits. And the bottom 90% went from about 52% down to about 33%, a third of all the checkable deposits. And so at the beginning of this chapter, I promised to expose the wealth disparity and income inequality that appears to be tearing society apart at the seams. And this is a picture of it. Look at that chart. Pass this around. This is a picture of the social unrest that is happening. It's a picture of the next part, which is a picture of envy, hatred, and intolerance. But we shouldn't blame the rich. There's so many politicians that want you to blame the rich and try and tax them out of existence. This is just politicians trying to get your vote. The rich didn't really have, and they didn't steal anything. This was all the fault of the central banks. In fact, it's just the opposite. The rich are the people that saved up. They started businesses. They make incredible sacrifices and shoulder incredible burdens to make all of the products and the services that we buy. And running these businesses, as a business owner, I know that running businesses is a nightmare. The amount of problems that you deal with constantly with the government and with employees, it just sometimes does not seem worth it. Especially government regulation, taxation, they just make it so incredibly difficult. So the rich are the people that create most of the prosperity in our society. So without them, there wouldn't be much of an economy. So don't demonize them. It's not their fault. They didn't do this. The Fed did it. Ben S. Bernanke did it. So Ben Bernanke is the one who got us to this point. You need to read his speech from 2002 titled Deflation, Making Sure It Doesn't Happen Here. Everything the Federal Reserve has done in response to the global financial crisis of 2008 and the pandemic plunge of 2020 is all laid out in that speech. So watch it, or just do an internet search for Mike Maloney, deflation, making sure it doesn't happen here, Ben Bernanke, and click on videos, and you'll see my video about this speech and decoding it, because it's hard to... Ben Bernanke, the way he writes makes your head hurt. So if you ever get a chance to read Ben Bernanke, don't, because you're going to end up with a headache. Let somebody else do it for you and then analyze it and boil it down. My headaches were back when I was reading this back in 2005, 6, and 7 and trying to figure out what it means. But I believe that someday in the future, after the next big financial crisis, financial historians will look back in both bewilderment and awe at the irony of the man whose ideas caused the crash of the global economy was the same man who won the Nobel Prize for those very same ideas way back in 2022. So a picture of envy, hatred, and intolerance. Look at that last chart again. That was the picture of the things that have caused the division that has exploded in America over the past decade or more, since 2008. It's the underlying pressure on society that has unleashed the things like civil unrest and the division between the left and right, such as I have never seen in my lifetime. And ominously, it's created a backlash and the reemergence of the most dangerous thing of all, something that threatens not only your freedom, but your very survival. And that is the growing support for an idea that has caused more pain and suffering and death than any other idea in history. It's the growing belief and support for socialism. Now, one of the big problems is that people that fall in the age group of 18 to 34 right now, about half of them have a positive view of socialism and a negative view of capitalism. Yet there is a direct, provable relationship between wealth, health, and happiness. Economic freedom creates economic prosperity, wealth. And prosperity creates a happier and healthier population. The people in the most economically free countries live almost 15 years longer than those in the least economically free. Socialist societies, dictatorships, oligarchies, and politically corrupt societies have all languished economically. Think of the literally billions of people who have lived and died under these oppressive ideologies over the past century, and whose lives were shortened by 10, 15, or 20 years because of it. Now, I want to take a little detour. This is the Economic Freedom of the World Index for 2022. And what you see here is they've taken all of these countries. There's 165 countries that produce reliable economic data. They put them in spreadsheets and they hit sort, and it's broken into 4 quartiles here. And this top quartile of the most economically free, the countries that have the fairest laws, the least corrupt courts, the smallest government, the lowest taxes compared to their GDP, and the least amount of rules and regulations, especially regarding small business, and also are very economically free internationally. You have the ability to trade, the ability to go anywhere in the world, buy, sell, invest in, import and export anything, and bring back your profits without regulations, taxation, and duties. The people that live in these countries live almost 15 years longer than the people that live in these countries. And it goes on from there. The income per capita in the least free countries and the most free countries, when adjusted for purchasing power parity. So the amount of goods and services that you can buy, the income is vastly, vastly different and much higher in the most free countries. When you look at the poorest 10% of the population's share of income, it's fairly high in these least free countries, not because the poor are richer in those countries, but because everybody is poor, and you're comparing the poor against the middle class and the rich. And in these countries,
Everybody is poor except the people that run the government. They're the ones that get to live in the mansions and drive around in limousines with bodyguards. Economic freedom and income earned by the poorest 10%. The poorest 10% in the most economically free countries, and this is all purchasing power parity adjusted. 14,000 compared to 1,700, and it goes on. This is life expectancy. The most free countries, your life expectancy is 80.4 years. The least free is 66 years. Infant mortality is highest in the least free countries and the most free countries. When you let capitalism reign, when you leave people alone to make transactions with one another, because that's what the free market is and that is what capitalism is, people being able to start businesses, invest in businesses, buy and sell goods and services to each other and from each other, that is capitalism in a free market. Poverty rates, school enrollment, and lastly, we have here the happiness index, the UN World Happiness Index. People in the most free countries are happier than people in the least free countries. So now back to the book. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and the Bank of Japan have all implemented policies of quantitative easing. This chapter covered only the wealth transfer in the United States, but it's the same for much of the rest of the world. It is all 100% the fault of these central banks and currency creation from future debt and the enslavement of the populations, which has caused the wealth disparity responsible for this socialistic backlash. So the big question, will your life and the lives of your children be shortened by the backlash to the economic policies of the world's major central banks? If socialism wins, then according to the data, I can almost guarantee it. Your life will be shorter, the lives of your children will be shorter. But if individualism, freedom, and liberty win, and I will add capitalism and free markets to this, then your future and that of your children should be very, very bright. Who the culprits are and the scale of the heist. To summarize, the culprits are the world's central banks, pure and simple. As for the scale of the heist, because the Federal Reserve data is so readily available and easy to come by, I've only analyzed the size of the robbery in the United States. And it's $7 trillion, about 1/3 of the US M2 currency supply of the United States of America. About 1/3 of the currency supply. This is huge. I'll leave analyzing all of the other, the BOJ, the BOE, and the ECB up to others to analyze this. I've done my job and started the ball rolling, but people need to dig into this and analyze the entire world economy. How has the entire world financial system been distorted by the world's central banks that get to steal from everybody by counterfeiting currency into existence by just typing it and then buying something? There's a quote here from the great Frederick Bastiat. If you haven't read any Frederick Bastiat, I highly encourage it. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in a society, over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. Now, as for the beneficiaries, as you'll see in the next chapter, the ultra-low interest rates set by the world's central banks have probably pushed residential real estate in much of the world to levels 50 to 100% higher than they would have been in a normal interest rate environment. The stimulus and economic manipulation that you've seen in this chapter has probably pushed stock markets to multiples of where they should actually be. So to summarize, the central banks, the robbers, as I started out chapter 4 with the robbers in the intro, have enriched themselves and their beneficiaries, the major stockholders and investors, by stealing from the following victims: everyone who holds currency in their bank account, wallet, pocket or purse or pension, everyone who pays federal taxes, and everyone who makes payments on a mortgage, auto loan, or any other kind of loan. Are you on the list above? Are you on it more than once? This entire chapter leads to a very big quandary. Central bankers are supposed to be some really smart people. They're a bunch of PhD economists. If they don't understand the wealth transfer that they are causing, then they are incompetent and do not belong in their jobs. But if they do understand the wealth transfer and this theft that they are creating, then they are immoral and they belong in jail. Which do you think? In closing, I leave you this quote from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. The decrease in purchasing power incurred by the holders of money due to inflation imparts gains to the issuers of money. I want to thank you for watching this part. We'll see you in the next part, part 8 of chapter 4, and that is the new slavery.
Well, I want to thank you for watching that. This was presented out of order because I wanted to present the strongest thing and the thing that goes best with my previous video, that is the supporting evidence. But we're going to post more of these videos that were made specifically for people when they're reading chapter 4 of my book, Great Gold and Silver Rush of the 21st Century. And remember that the mission of the media team here at GoldSilver.com is to enlighten the world that maximum prosperity can only be achieved through individual freedom, free markets, and sound money, and that is a fact. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.